Disclaimer: this is a fictional dramatization created for artistic, emotional, and educational storytelling purposes. All characters and events are entirely fictional and created using AI tools. No impersonation, misrepresentation, or harm is intended. The content contains scenes of danger involving child characters. However, no real persons or minors were involved in its production. Grace's Love Stories produces scripted, AI-generated stories that promote, entertain, inspire kindness, and emotional connection. We respect our viewers and strictly adhere to YouTube's policies.
The fire in the great hearth spat a resinous sigh, its warmth a familiar comfort against the evening chill seeping through the lodge's thick pine walls. Outside, the first snows of the season clung to the boughs of the ancient forest, muffling the world in a blanket of profound quiet. It was a stillness Elise Varick had once cherished, the peaceful mantle of her life as Luna to the Valmon pack. Now it felt like a weight, a heavy silence that pressed in on her, amplifying the ticking of the tall clock in the corner. Each tick was a second stolen from the fragile peace she had fought so hard to maintain. For months, the rumors had been a poison in the air, a scent of rot beneath the clean frost, and she had been the antidote, her loyalty the only cure she could offer. She ran a hand over the smooth, worn wood of the mantle, her fingers tracing the carved lineage of Alpha Kings. Her mate, Carrick Valmond, was the latest name etched into the formidable history. He was strong, burdened, a king in every sense of the word, and she had believed in the weight on his shoulders. She had believed his late nights were spent with ledgers and territorial maps, his silences born of a sovereign's burden, not a lover's guilt. Her defense of him had been fierce, her voice unwavering in the face of the pack's hushed speculation. But belief was a fragile shield, and tonight she could feel the cracks spreading through it like ice splintering underfoot. The lie she had so carefully tended was about to die on her doorstep. Then came the knock. It wasn't the heavy, commanding rap of a pack warrior or the hurried tap of a messenger. It was a calm, deliberate sound. Twice, solid and certain, it cut through the deceptive quiet of the lodge and went straight to the marrow of her bones. A tremor went through her, a primal instinct her human side could not suppress. Her inner wolf, long quiet and content at her mate's side, stirred with a low, uneasy growl. The clock ticked again, loud as a hammer blow. Ellis smoothed the deep green wool of her dress, her hands trembling slightly as she forced them to her sides. She was the Luna. She would not show fear in her own home. She crossed the great room, the floorboards groaning softly under her feet, and pulled open the heavy oak door. The cold night air swept in, carrying the scent of snow and pine, and with it, the scent of another she-wolf. The woman standing on her threshold was no one of rank. An omega by the subtle deference in her posture, yet her eyes held no submission. They were a calm, steady gray, and they met Elise's gaze without apology. She was wrapped in a simple, homespun cloak, but it couldn't hide the unmistakable, proud swell of her belly. She was heavily pregnant. Ellis's breath caught in her throat. The rumors solidified, taking shape in the form of this woman, Brindis Holt. The name echoed in her memory from the whispers she had so violently silenced. Luna Varick, the Omega said, her voice as even as her gaze. There was no malice in it, no triumph, only a quiet finality. Ellis found her own voice, though it felt like a stranger's. What is it you want? The question was a shield, a weak and desperate attempt to reclaim the power of her station. But Brindis didn't flinch. She simply held her ground, a living testament to a truth Elise had refused to see. I am not here to cause you pain, Brindis said, and the sincerity in her tone was a cruelty all its own. I am here because the child deserves a name. It deserves its father. Each word was a careful, deliberate blow. The air grew thick, charged with the unspoken reality that had lived in the shadows for so long. Ellis felt the mate bond, the sacred, shimmering cord that tied her soul to Carrick's, begin to fray. It wasn't a snap, but a slow, agonizing unraveling. 1,000 tiny threads of trust and love pulling apart one by one. Her wolf paced within her, snarling not with aggression, but with a deep, wounded confusion. It could smell the Alpha King's scent clinging to this woman, woven into the fabric of her cloak, buried deep in her skin. He is not here, Ellis managed, her voice hollow. "He will be," Brindis replied, with a certainty that chilled Ellis to the core. She hadn't come to plead a case. She had come to be seen. As if summoned by her words, the sound of heavy footsteps crunched on the snowy path. The scent of ozone, pine, and pure, undiluted power preceded him. Carrick. A wave of nauseating hope and terror washed over Elise. He would fix this. He would send this woman away. He would look at Elise, his true mate, and the world would right itself. He rounded the corner of the lodge, his broad shoulders filling the night. He was every inch the Alpha King, scarred, powerful, with eyes that held the wisdom and weariness of his line. He stopped dead when he saw them, two she-wolves framed in the golden lamplight of his doorway, Ellis, his Luna, his mate, and Brindis, the Omega, her belly a declaration of his betrayal. The silence that fell was absolute. It was heavier than the snow-laden trees, deeper than the winter night. In that crushing stillness, Ellis watched her mate's face. She saw not shock, but resignation. She saw the cornered look of a wolf trapped by his own nature. He looked from Brindis's swollen form to Ellis's pale, shattered expression, and in his eyes, she saw the truth she had so long denied. The mate bond, that living, breathing connection between them, did not offer comfort. It became an instrument of torture. Through it, she felt not his love, but a tidal wave of his guilt, his regret, and something else, something that broke her far more than the lie itself. A deep, instinctual protectiveness for the Omega and the child she carried. It was a physical agony, a cold, sharp pressure built in Elise's chest, as if a hand were squeezing her heart. The world seemed to tilt, the warm light of the lodge dimming at the edges. Her wolf let out a silent, soul-shattering howl of betrayal, a sound of such profound grief that Elise thought she might splinter apart from the force of it. The bond didn't just fray, it split. A chasm opened between them, cold and dark and final. Carrick took a step forward, his gaze fixed on Brindis. He didn't speak to Elise. He didn't even look at her. His first words were for the other woman. "Brindis, you should not be out in the cold." His voice was rough, a low rumble of command laced with concern. He reached out, not to his mate, but to the Omega, his hand hovering near her arm as if to guide her into the warmth, into their home. That small, instinctive gesture was the final, killing blow. It was an acknowledgement, a claiming, more powerful than any confession. Ellis felt the last vestiges of her strength crumble. The Luna who had stood before her pack and defended her alpha's honor was gone, replaced by a woman hollowed out by the truth. The air in her lungs turned to frost. She could feel the stares of the pack from the surrounding lodges, could sense them drawn to the windows by the suffocating tension that poured from the alpha's home. Her private agony was becoming a public spectacle. Finally, Carrick turned his gaze to her. His face was a mask of stone, his eyes holding the cold, hard light of a king making a decision. There was no love there now, only duty, a terrible, crushing duty that had no room for her. "Ellis," he said, and her name from his lips was like the scrape of steel on bone. He didn't move closer. The chasm between them was real now, a space he would not cross. He drew a breath, the ruler taking precedence over the mate. "You will go to the north wing. The dowager's chambers are empty. Stay there." It wasn't a request. It was a dismissal, a soft banishment from her own life. He was sending her to the rooms reserved for widowed Lunas, a place of memory and quiet exile. He was removing her from the heart of the home, from the heart of his life, to make room for his new reality. He held her gaze for a moment longer, a silent command for her to obey, to accept this shattering of their world without a fight. Then he turned his back on her completely, placing a firm, possessive hand on Brindis's shoulder and guiding her inside, into the warmth of the fire. The heavy oak door swung shut with a soft, final click, leaving Ellis standing alone in the cold entryway, the scent of her mate and his pregnant lover already filling the home that was no longer hers. The click of the latch was a sound as final as a spade of earth hitting a coffin lid. For a long moment, Ellis did not move. She stood frozen in the entryway, the pall of the night air clinging to her like a shroud. The warmth of the great hall was behind a closed door, a world she no longer belonged to. She could smell it through the oak, the familiar scent of burning pine, of beeswax polish, and now, woven through it all like a venomous thread, the scent of the Omega Brindis. It was the scent of her own displacement. The Dowager's chambers. Stay there. Carrick's command echoed in the hollow space he had carved inside her. It was not a suggestion. It was the Alpha King's law, spoken to a subordinate. The mate who had once been his equal was gone. In her place was a problem to be managed, a piece to be moved off the board. Her wolf, a creature of pride and instinct, raged against the dismissal. It wanted to claw at the door, to howl its grief and fury, until the very timbers of the lodge splintered. But Elise clamped down on the impulse with the iron will of a trained Luna. A scene would only deepen her humiliation. It would give the pack, whose eyes she could feel on her even now, the spectacle they craved. Pride was all she had left. With a stillness that felt brittle, as if the slightest tremor would shatter her into 1,000 pieces, she turned. She did not look back at the door. To look back would be to hope. She walked away from the heart of her home, her every step an act of excruciating self-control. The main thoroughfare of the lodge was quiet, but it was a living quiet, thick with awareness. Doorways were suddenly occupied. Figures lingered in the shadows of the crossbeams. She could feel their gazes on her back, a physical weight of pity, curiosity, and for some, a cruel flicker of satisfaction. The pack sensed the shift in power as keenly as a wolf senses a change in the wind. The bond between Alpha and Luna was the bedrock of their stability. A fracture in it sent tremors through them all. She kept her chin high, her eyes fixed on the archway that led to the north wing. She could smell their emotions in the air, the cloying sweetness of pity from the older she-wolves, the sharp, acrid scent of fear from the younger ones who saw in her a cautionary tale. Worst of all was the scent of triumph from Elspeth, the beta female who had always viewed Elise's southern lineage with suspicion. Elise did not give them the satisfaction of seeing her falter. She walked as a queen walks to the gallows, each step measured and deliberate. The north wing was colder. The rushlights burned lower here, casting long, dancing shadows that clung to the walls like wraiths. This part of the lodge was old, the original structure built by Carrick's great-grandfather. It smelled of dust, of time, of things left behind. It smelled of endings. The air grew still, the sounds of the pack fading behind her, until all she could hear was the rustle of her own dress and the frantic, panicked thumping of her own heart. The door to the Dowager's chambers was at the very end of the corridor. It was dark, unadorned oak, the iron handle cold and stiff beneath her trembling fingers. It groaned in protest as she pushed it open, the sound echoing in the profound silence. The room within was a cavern of shadows, preserved in time. Moonlight filtered through a tall, grimy window, illuminated dust motes dancing in the still air. The furniture, a heavy four-poster bed, a writing desk, a pair of severe-looking armchairs, was draped in white shrouds, making them look like silent, waiting ghosts. The air was thick with the scent of dried lavender and regret. This was a place where life wound down, a chamber of memory and quiet, dignified sorrow. It was a tomb, and Carrick had just buried her alive in it. She closed the door behind her, the soft thud severing her last connection to the world she knew. Alone, in the suffocating dark, her composure finally broke. A gasping sob tore from her throat, raw and ragged. She stumbled forward and braced her hands on the shrouded desk, her knuckles white. The pain from the fractured bond was a living thing. It was not a clean break, but a jagged, tearing wound in her soul. A constant icy fire burned where the warmth of his presence used to be. Through it, she could still feel him, but the connection was corrupted. It no longer carried love or comfort. It transmitted only echoes, distorted and cruel. She felt a phantom surge of his irritation, not at his betrayal, but at the inconvenience of it all. She felt a wave of his grim resolve, the king putting his dynasty before all else. The child Brindis carried was the future. Ellis, barren and now disgraced, was the past. Her wolf whimpered, a low, keening sound of pure desolation. It didn't understand. Its alpha, its other half, had turned away. It kept pacing the cage of her mind, searching for the familiar connection, the reassuring presence, and finding only a cold, gaping void. Elise pushed herself away from the desk and began to pace the cold floorboards. The lies she had told herself mocked her now. He's just burdened. He's carrying the weight of the crown. The pack needs him to be strong. She had spun his distance into a noble sacrifice. his emotional absence into a king's burden. She had defended him, not just to the pack, but to the deepest, most knowing part of herself that had sensed something was wrong. She had seen the way he looked at Brindis during the last harvest festival, a fleeting glance, too long, too deep. She had dismissed it. She had smelled the Omega's scent lingering on his tunic one night and accepted his explanation that he'd been settling a dispute in the lower village. Lie after lie, she had swallowed them whole because the alternative was unthinkable. She stopped in front of a long, clouded mirror hanging on the wall. With a shaking hand, she reached up and pulled the dust cover away. It fell to the floor in a soft, whispering heap. She stared at her own reflection, a pale stranger with wide, haunted eyes and a mouth tight with unshed tears. This was the Luna of the Valmon pack. A queen without a king, a mate without a mate, a fraud. The bond pulsed, a sharp stabbing pain that made her gasp and press a hand to her chest. It was different this time, stronger. It was a surge of raw, primal emotion from Carrick. Not guilt, not sorrow. It was possessiveness, a fierce, predatory claiming. It was an emotion she knew intimately. It was the feeling that had coursed through the bond when he had first marked her, years ago under a full moon, his teeth sinking into the juncture of her neck and shoulder, sealing their souls together. But this wave of feeling was not for her. It was directed elsewhere. The connection, though broken, was still a conduit. Through it, she felt an echo of what he was feeling, a shadow of what he was doing. She felt the surge of his power, the guttural growl of the alpha asserting his dominance. She felt the heat of his body, the taste of another's skin, and then an agony so sharp, so blinding, it dropped her to her knees. It was the echo of a claiming bite. She felt the phantom sensation of teeth sinking into flesh, of blood welling, of a new permanent mark being seared into the soul of another, a mark of ownership, of absolute connection. He was marking Brindis, now, in their lodge, perhaps in their bed. He was overwriting their bond, severing the last sacred threads that tied her to him and weaving them into a new pattern with another. A scream built in her throat, but no sound emerged. It was a silent, visceral agony that tore through every cell of her being. The mark on her own shoulder, the symbol of their union, burned with a cold, searing fire, as if the magic that sustained it was being poisoned at the source. The world went gray at the edges. The musty air of the room felt too thick to breathe. He had not just replaced her, he had erased her. Lying on the dusty floor of her new prison, Ellis Varick finally understood. This was not just a betrayal of the heart. It was a fundamental changing of the world. He had chosen his heir over his mate, and in doing so, he had unmade her, leaving her as nothing more than a ghost to haunt the halls of a life that was no longer hers. The stillness of the lie had been broken, replaced by the deafening roar of the truth, and in that truth, there was no room for her at all. Time ceased to be a river and became a frozen, black lake. Elise lay on the dusty floorboards, curled around the gaping wound in her soul where the bond had been savaged. The phantom agony of the second marking receded, leaving behind a chilling, profound numbness. It was as if a vital organ had been crudely excised, and her body, her spirit, hadn't yet decided whether to die from the shock or learn to live without it. The mark on her shoulder, once a source of warmth that spread through her veins like liquid sunlight, was now a patch of dead flesh. It did not burn, it did not ache. It was simply cold, a circle of ice on her skin, a permanent reminder of an extinguished fire. Her wolf was silent. The creature of instinct and pride that had raged and grieved within her had retreated into some deep, inaccessible cavern of her mind, licking a wound too grievous to be borne. The silence was more terrifying than its howls had been. It was the silence of utter defeat. Slowly, as the first pale gray light of dawn seeped through the grimy window, Ellis began to move. Her limbs were heavy, leaden with a weariness that went bone deep. She pushed herself into a sitting position, her back against the shrouded leg of the writing desk. The dust motes, illuminated by the dawn, danced like tiny, indifferent spirits in the cold air. The room was just as it was, a crypt, and she was its new occupant. She looked at her hands, pale and trembling in her lap. They were the hands of a Luna. They had comforted sick children, signed treaties, held her Alpha's face as he slept. Now they were just hands, empty, powerless, stripped of purpose. A wave of nausea rolled through her, bitter and acidic. She had believed herself the anchor of Carrick's reign, his partner, the heart of the pack. She saw now that she had only ever been a placeholder, a temporary comfort until a vessel for his lineage could be found. Her barrenness, a quiet sorrow they had once shared, had become her indictment. A floorboard creaked in the corridor outside. Footsteps slow and deliberate, not Carrick's heavy, commanding tread. These were lighter, yet held an authority of their own. Elise stiffened, pulling the tattered shreds of her dignity around her like a cloak. She would not be found huddled on the floor like a beaten cur. With a groan of protest from every muscle, she forced herself to her feet, swaying slightly as a wave of dizziness washed over her. She stood tall, facing the door, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The handle turned. The door swung inward to reveal Morwen, Carrick's aunt, and the pack's eldest dowager. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes dark and shrewd, missing nothing. She was the keeper of the pack's traditions, a woman whose loyalty was not to individuals, but to the Valmon line itself. In her hands she carried a small wooden tray bearing a bowl of steaming stew, a hunk of bread, and a mug of water, a meal for an invalid, or a prisoner. "Child," Morwen said, her voice a low rasp, like stones grinding together. She stepped inside, her gaze sweeping over Elise's disheveled state, the dusty dress, the haunted look in her eyes. There was no pity in her expression, only a grim, pragmatic assessment. She set the tray down on the shrouded desk. The scent of the stew, hearty, simple fare, nothing like the spiced meat served at the Luna's table, filled the stale air. It was an offering, but also a statement. "You must eat," Morwen stated, not asked. Ellis found her voice, though it felt rusty from disuse. "I am not hungry. Grief does not excuse foolishness. Your body needs fuel, even if your spirit does not." Morwen folded her hands into the sleeves of her dark gray robes, her posture unyielding. "The pack is unsettled. They saw what happened. They saw their Alpha King bring his pregnant mistress into my home and cast his mate aside," Elise corrected, a sliver of ice in her tone. A flicker of something, perhaps grudging respect for the show of fire, passed through Morwen's eyes before being extinguished. They saw their king secure his succession. They saw him make a hard choice for the future of us all. An alpha without an heir is a crack in the foundation of the world. Other packs circle. Betas grow ambitious. His duty is to his name, to his blood. You of all people should understand the weight of that. The words were meant to be a balm of logic, a cold dose of reality, but they felt like salt being rubbed into the raw wound. You were not enough. You failed in your primary duty. "And my duty?" Ellis asked, her voice trembling with a tightly controlled fury. "Was it not to be his mate? To uphold a sacred bond he swore before the elders and the old gods? The bond is a tool for strength, for continuity, Pa," Morwen said, her voice softening almost imperceptibly. "When one tool fails, a stronger one must be forged. The girl, Brindis, she is strong, her bloodline is old, and she carries his son. The seers have confirmed it. His son." The word hung in the air, a death knell for any lingering, desperate hope Elise might have harbored. It was all planned, calculated. This was not a simple affair, a moment of weakness. This was a coup of the heart, a strategic replacement of a barren Luna with a fertile one. "He has marked her," Ellis whispered, the words tasting like ash. "I felt it." Morwen's gaze did not waver. "It was necessary to protect the child, to make her claim undeniable. Her status as his second mate is now sealed." Second mate. The term was a fiction, a polite lie to cover the brutal truth. There was no such thing. There was only the mate and the one who came after. The old woman took a step closer. "Carrick, he does this with a heavy heart. He does not forget the years you have stood by his side. He has commanded that you are to be cared for. You will want for nothing. This wing will be yours. You are to remain here, for now, for your own protection. The pack is volatile. It is better to let the whispers die down." A gilded cage, a comfortable prison, she was being erased from public life, hidden away like a shameful secret, while her replacement was elevated. The thought ignited a spark in the cold void where her grief had been, a tiny hard kernel of rage. As Morwen spoke of Carrick's heavy heart, a memory sharp and vivid tore through Elise. It was the night of her own marking. Years ago, they had stood on the high bluffs overlooking the valley, the full moon bathing them in silver light. Carrick had turned to her, his eyes glowing with a fierce, untamed love. He had taken her hand, pressing his lips to her knuckles. "You are the other half of my soul, Elise," he had whispered, his voice thick with an emotion that had felt as real and solid as the mountain beneath their feet. "There is no crown without you, no life. Without you, my wolf knows you. It will only ever know you." Then he had lowered his head, and the bite had been a searing, ecstatic pain, a brand of forever on her soul. The memory was so clear, so potent, it was a physical blow. The lie of it, the bitter, cruel hypocrisy choked her. The rage grew, a cold, clean fire that began to burn away the fog of her despair. "Tell my mate," she began, then corrected herself, the word tasting like poison. "Tell the Alpha King that his concern is unnecessary." Morwen watched her, her dark eyes seeming to see the shift inside Elise. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Eat the stew, Elise. A cold journey requires a warm meal." It was a strange, cryptic statement. Before Elise could question it, the old woman turned and left, closing the door softly behind her, leaving Elise alone once more with the untouched food and the ghost of a promise. She stood for a long time, the memory of Carrick's words echoing in her mind. "It will only ever know you." He had lied. Or perhaps in that moment he had believed it. It hardly mattered now. The rage did not demand tears or screams, it demanded action. She would not sit in this tomb and slowly fade into a forgotten memory. She would not be protected. She would not be hidden. Ignoring the tray of food, she moved to a large carved chest at the foot of the bed. She threw back the heavy lid. Inside, packed away in cedar and lavender, were the winter cloaks of the Dowager Luna, who had come before her. Elise pulled out the heaviest one, a deep gray wool lined with rabbit fur. It smelled of disuse and time, but it was warm. She wrapped it around her shoulders, pulling the hood up over her head. She would not be the broken thing hiding in the shadows. She would face the truth of her new world head-on. She needed to see it, to breathe it in, to let the reality of it scour her clean of any lingering hope. She slipped out of the room, her feet silent on the stone floor of the deserted corridor. The north wing was a maze of forgotten passages. She knew them well. She bypassed the main lodge, taking a narrow servant staircase that led to a small, seldom-used door at the side of the building. The cold that hit her as she stepped outside was a brutal, welcome shock. It stole the air from her lungs and turned her breath to white mist. The world was blanketed in a pristine layer of fresh snow, glittering under the weak morning sun. The air was sharp and clean, and for a moment, it cleared her head. She stood in the shadow of the wing, her heart pounding a hard, steady rhythm against her ribs. She was outside. She was free of her prison. She pulled the cloak tighter and looked across the courtyard toward the great hall. And then she saw them. They were standing just inside the tall, arched window of the main dining hall, framed like a portrait. Carrick, her Carrick, his back to the window, his broad shoulders shielding the woman before him. Brindis. Elise could see the soft curve of her cheek, the gentle swell of her belly. Carrick was speaking to her, his head inclined. Then, with a tenderness that shattered the last remaining fragments of Elise's heart, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from Brindis's face. He leaned down, his large frame bending to hers, and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead. It was a quiet, domestic moment, a gesture of infinite care and possession. This was his future, his mate, his son. And Elise Varick was the ghost outside in the cold, watching it all. The image burned itself onto the back of her eyes, the tender press of his lips to Brindis's forehead, a benediction, a claiming. It was a brand of a different kind, one that seared away not just her future, but her past. Every memory of his touch, every whispered endearment, was now tainted by this new reality. The cold seeped through the thick wool of her cloak, no longer a shock, but a familiar companion. It settled deep in her marrow, a cold that would never leave. She turned away from the window, pulling her hood lower to shadow her face. To be seen now, a specter haunting the edges of their new life, would be the final, unbearable humiliation. She retreated, her footsteps silent in the deep snow, melting back into the shadows of the north wing from which she had come. The rage that had been a tiny, hard kernel was now a slow-burning fire in her veins. It did not make her hot. It made her icily calm. Grief was a storm, wild and unpredictable. This cold fury was a glacier, immense and unstoppable, carving a new path through the landscape of her soul. She did not return to the dowager's chambers. The thought of that dusty tomb was suffocating. Instead, she walked the cold, silent corridors of her prison, her mind working with a clarity she hadn't possessed in months. She had been living in a fog of willful ignorance, propping up a crumbling facade with her own desperate hope. Now the fog had lifted, and the view was stark and terrible, but it was real. She needed to face him, not as the weeping, broken woman he had dismissed at her own door, but as the Luna he had betrayed. She would not scream or plead. She would not give him the satisfaction of her tears. She would demand an accounting. A debt was owed. Not of love, for that was clearly bankrupt, but of truth. Her path took her toward the heart of the lodge, toward the Alpha's study, his sanctuary, the seat of his power where he met with his betas and planned the pack's future, a future she was no longer a part of. The guards at the end of the corridor, two hardened warriors she had known since they were pups, stiffened as she approached. Their eyes, usually warm with respect for their Luna, were now filled with a confused mixture of pity and apprehension. "Luna," one of them, Tegan murmured, his gaze flicking nervously toward the study door. He made a move to block her path, hesitant but firm. "The Alpha is occupied." "I am aware," Elise said, her voice quiet but edged with a steel that made him pause. She looked him in the eye, not as a broken woman, but as the she-wolf who had ruled beside the Alpha King for 10 years. "Step aside, Tegan." For a heartbeat he wavered, caught between the Alpha's implicit command and the lingering authority in her voice. Then with a dip of his head that was both an apology and a surrender, he moved. She did not knock. She pushed the heavy, iron-strapped door open and stepped inside. The trespass felt like the first honest thing she had done in months. The room was just as she remembered, dominated by a massive oak desk, shelves overflowing with scrolls and leather-bound books, and a fire roaring in the stone hearth. The air smelled of wood smoke, old parchment, and him, that familiar, powerful scent of pine and winter air that had once been her greatest comfort. And beneath it, faint but undeniable, was the sweet floral scent of Brindis, the scent of her own erasure. Carrick was standing by the fire, his back to her, staring into the flames. He did not seem surprised. He must have heard the guards, must have sensed her approach. He turned slowly, and her breath caught. He looked immense in the flickering firelight, his scarred face carved from granite, his eyes holding the weary weight of his crown. He was the most powerful man she had ever known, and the greatest stranger. "I told Morwen you were to remain in your chambers," he said. It was not an accusation, but a statement of fact, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "And I am no longer a pup to be ordered to my den," she replied, her voice steady despite the frantic pounding of her heart. She walked further into the room, stopping on the opposite side of the great bearskin rug that lay before the hearth. The chasm between them was now literal. "We need to talk. There is nothing left to say." He turned his gaze back to the fire. "What is done is done. You will not dismiss me like this, Carrick." The cold rage gave her strength. "You owe me more than a closed door and a comfortable prison. You owe me the truth." He let out a heavy sigh, the sound of a mountain groaning under its own weight. He finally turned to face her fully, and in his eyes she saw not love, not hate, but a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. "Truth? You want truth, Elise? The truth is that our pack needs an heir. The truth is that our neighbors to the east are testing our borders, waiting for a sign of weakness. An aging, childless Alpha is the greatest weakness of all. Brindis carries my son. That is the only truth that matters now. So 10 years of loyalty, of partnership, our bond, all of it was just a placeholder, a temporary arrangement until something better came along." At the mention of their bond, a flicker of something painful crossed his face. He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. It was not supposed to be like this. "But it is," she pressed, stepping onto the edge of the rug, closing the distance between them. He smelled so strongly of her, of the other she-wolf. The scent filled Elisa's lungs, and she felt a wave of dizziness. I want to know when. When did you decide that our life together was disposable? He ran a hand over his face, the gesture of a man pushed to his absolute limit. It was never a single decision. It was a slow erosion. Every month you did not conceive was another stone wearing away at the foundation. Every hopeful look from the elders that turned to pity, every whisper from a rival pack. It built up, Elise. The weight of it. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were bleak. I am a king first, a mate second. I have made the only choice a king could make. You have made the choice of a coward, she breathed, the words falling like ice chips into the silence. You hid your betrayal behind the duties of a crown. You let me defend you. You let me fight the rumors you knew were true. You let me make a fool of myself, of my love for you, in front of the entire pack. A muscle jumped in his jaw. That I regret. Your humiliation was not my intent. What was your intent, Carrick? To keep me as a quiet, comfortable fixture in your life while you built another one in the shadows. Her voice rose, the icy control beginning to crack. To have your Luna and your heir, and hope the two worlds would never collide? Enough! He roared, his alpha power flooding the room. A physical force that made the very air tremble. It was a command meant to cow, to silence, to force submission. In the past, her own wolf would have instinctively lowered its head, but her wolf was silent, and Elise stood her ground, unflinching. The show of force had no effect on her, and the realization seemed to drain the anger from him, leaving only that terrible weariness behind. He saw then that the woman standing before him was not the mate he had known. The connection that had allowed his power to hold sway over her was gone. The bond we shared is broken, Ellis, he said, his voice dropping to a low, rough whisper. It is ash. There is nothing left to salvage. I know, she said softly. I felt you mark her. I felt you burn our history to the ground to build her a home. She took another step closer, until she could have reached out and touched the cold, hard wall of his chest. I am not here for salvage. I am here for a reckoning. A king pays his debts. You owe me one. Not for my heart, but for my life, for the 10 years I gave to you, to this pack. What is to become of me? He looked down at her, and for the first time, she saw a glimmer of the man he used to be, a flash of genuine, profound sorrow. You will be cared for. You will hold the title of Dowager Luna. You will want for nothing. I will be a ghost, she countered, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. A living relic of your first failed marriage, locked away so as not to inconvenience your new family. I will not live like that. I will not be your pet project of guilt, kept and fed in a cage. Give me another choice. He was silent for a long time, the only sound the crackling of the fire. He seemed to be wrestling with a decision, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the walls of the study. When he finally spoke, his voice was devoid of all emotion, as flat and final as a gravestone. Our bond. It was never whole, Elise, he said, and the words struck her with the force of a physical blow. The elders saw it from the beginning, a flaw in the weave. They said it was a beautiful, hollow thing. They warned it would not produce an heir, that it was never meant to last. Elise stared at him, her mind reeling. A lie. It had to be a lie. A cruel justification made up to ease his conscience. You're lying. Am I? He asked, his gaze finally locking with hers, cold and unwavering. Why do you think your wolf has been so quiet all these years, so easily subdued? A true, whole bond would have made her a queen. Ours made her a companion. It was enough for love, but not for legacy. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and delivered the final, killing blow. You are not barren, Ellis. We were barren, together. The world tilted on its axis. All these years she had carried the silent shame of her empty womb, believing it to be her failing alone. He had let her believe it. You have two paths, he said, his voice the sound of a closing door. You may remain here, as I have offered, a shadow with an honored name, and watch another woman raise my son and rule at my side, or you can leave. He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. Renounce the Valmon name, break the last threads of our history, and seek a new life beyond our borders. You will be a ghost to our people, erased from the ledgers, You will be given a horse and enough supplies to reach the southern territories, but you will go as no one, nameless, without rank or pack, a lone wolf. He had given her a choice not between life and death, but between two different kinds of oblivion: stay and be a living ghost, a constant witness to her own replacement, or leave and become nothing, a whisper on the wind, utterly alone in a world that had no place for the wolf who had lost her pack. The two choices he offered hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. Stay and be a ghost, leave and be nothing. Both were a form of death. One was slow, a gradual fading in a gilded cage. The other was swift, a plunge into the cold, indifferent wilderness. For a wild, terrified moment, the thought of staying, of clinging to the familiar pain, was a powerful temptation. Here, at least, were walls, a bed, the memory of a life, but then the image of Carrick kissing Brindis's forehead flashed in her mind, and the memory of his final, cruel confession, "We were barren, together," echoed in her soul. He had not only betrayed her. He had allowed her to carry a shame that was equally his. He had watched her grief and said nothing. To stay would be to choke on that poison every single day. The cold, clean rage that had sustained her solidified into a single diamond-hard point of resolve. "I will leave," Elise said. The words were quiet, but they landed with the force of a landslide, altering the landscape between them forever. She saw a flicker of surprise in Carrick's eyes, quickly masked. Perhaps he had expected her to choose the cage. Perhaps he had underestimated the pride of the woman he had unmade. "So be it," he said, his voice flat, betraying nothing. He turned from her and walked to his desk, all business now, the king sealing a treaty, not exiling his mate of 10 years. He pulled a small, heavy pouch from a drawer. "This is gold, more than enough to see you to the southern cities." He took his own silver-hilted dagger from its sheath on the desk and laid it beside the pouch. "You will need a weapon." She looked at the items. The gold, the blade, a king's severance, cold, practical, and impersonal. She did not move to take them. "I want only a horse and a day's worth of supplies," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "I will not take your gold. I will not carry a debt to you into my new life." He looked up at that, a frown creasing his brow. "Ellis, the world outside these borders is not kind to lone she-wolves. Your pride will get you killed." "Then I will die," she replied, and the simple finality of it silenced him. "But I will die free of you." A heavy silence descended upon the room. In it, Elise could feel the last frayed threads of their shared history snapping, one by one. The 10 years they had built together were being dismantled, razed to the ground by their own hands. It was an excruciating, necessary demolition. "The horse will be waiting for you at the east gate at sunrise," he said, his voice rough. He would not look at her. He busied himself with a scroll on his desk, his shoulders rigid. The Alpha King had made his decree. The audience was over. Elise turned without another word and walked out of the study. She did not look back. To look back would be to see the ruin of her life, and she needed to fix her gaze forward, on the terrifying, unknown path ahead. The guards, Tegan and the other, stared at her as she emerged, their faces etched with shock and a dawning, horrified understanding. They must have heard everything. She met their gazes, her own clear and steady, and gave them a slight, formal nod of farewell. They were no longer her guards. She was no longer their Luna. She was a stranger passing through. She did not return to the dowager's chambers. Her life there was over before it had even begun. Instead, she walked to the small room she had kept since she was a young she-wolf, before she had moved into the Alpha's grand quarters. It was a simple, sparse room, holding little more than a bed, a small chest, and the lingering scent of her own history. She moved with a calm, detached efficiency, as if she were a stranger packing for someone else. She stripped off the fine green wool dress of the Luna and pulled on a pair of sturdy leather breeches, a warm tunic, and worn, comfortable boots. She braided her long, dark hair tightly, the familiar motion a small comfort in a world turned upside down. From the chest, she took only 2 things: a worn, fur-lined cloak that had been her mother's, and a small, crudely carved wooden wolf, a toy her father had made for her when she was a child. They were the only pieces of her past that were truly hers, untouched by Carrick, untainted by the Valmond name. She did not sleep. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, the small wooden wolf clutched in her hand and waited for the dawn. Through the fractured remnants of the bond, she felt distant, muffled echoes of Carrick. She felt a surge of grim satisfaction as he explained his decision to his inner circle. She felt a wave of profound tenderness as he checked on the sleeping Brindis. Each echo was a fresh stab of pain, but she no longer flinched from it. She absorbed it, let it fuel the icy fire within her. It was a reminder of why she was leaving. As the first faint hint of gray lightened the eastern sky, she stood. She slung a small satchel with the wooden wolf inside over her shoulder, wrapped herself in her mother's cloak, and walked out of the room, closing the door softly behind her. The lodge was quiet, the pre-dawn stillness broken only by the crackle of banked fires. She moved through the familiar halls like a ghost, a silent farewell to a life that was already a memory. The east gate was the least used, a small functional exit that led toward the rugged, untamed mountains. A single sturdy-looking gray mare stood tethered to the post, saddled and ready. A waterskin and a small bundle of what was likely bread and dried meat were tied to the saddle. Carrick had kept his word. A figure stepped out of the shadows of the gatehouse. It was Morwen. The old dowager's face was unreadable in the dim light. "I had hoped you would choose the wiser path," Morwen said, her voice a low rasp in the cold air. "Wisdom and survival are not always the same thing," Ellis replied, her breath misting in front of her. Morwen studied her for a long moment, her dark eyes seeming to pierce through the layers of Ellis's pain to the core of her resolve. "The world will try to break you. It is a hard place for those without a pack." "I have already been broken," Ellis said. "There is nothing left to fear." The old she-wolf seemed to accept this. She reached into the folds of her robe and pulled out a small leather-wrapped object. It was a knife, but a simple one, its handle worn smooth with use, its blade clean and sharp. It was nothing like the ornate dagger Carrick had offered. This was a tool. "A king's gift is a chain," Morwen said, pressing the knife into Ellis's hand. "An old woman's gift is a key. Use it well." Ellis looked from the knife to Morwen's face, searching for the meaning behind the cryptic words. Was this pity, a final act of kindness, or something more? "Why?" Ellis asked. "Because the Valmon pack pays its debts," Morwen said, her gaze intense. "You served us well for 10 years. You defended a lie with honor. That kind of loyalty is a rare thing. It should not go unrewarded, nor should it go unavenged." The last word was almost a whisper. A dangerous secret passed between them. A seed of something dark and powerful was planted in that single word. Morwen took a step back, melting into the shadows. "Ride east, follow the sun, do not look back." Elisa's fingers closed around the cool, smooth handle of the knife. A key. She slid it into her belt, the weight of it a small, solid comfort. She untethered the horse, swung herself into the saddle, and without a backward glance, nudged the mare into a walk, riding out of the gate and away from the only home she had ever known. The gate closed behind her with a soft, final thud. She was alone. The silence of the forest was absolute, broken only by the soft crunch of the mare's hooves in the snow. The rising sun cast long, distorted shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across her path. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of primal fear through her. She was prey now, a lone wolf, without the strength and safety of a pack. She rode for hours, pushing the horse, pushing herself, needing to put as much distance as possible between her and the life that was no more. The sun climbed higher, the day grew brighter, but the cold in her bones remained. Late in the afternoon, as she guided the horse through a narrow, rocky pass, she felt a sudden, violent tearing sensation in her soul. It was so intense it made her cry out, clutching at her chest. The fractured bond, the last dying connection to Carrick, was being violently severed. She knew, with an instinct that went deeper than thought, what was happening. Brindis was giving birth. The heir was being born, and with his first breath, the last vestige of Elisa's place in that world was being utterly and finally erased. A wave of such profound desolation washed over her that the world went black. She slumped forward in the saddle, the reins slipping from her numb fingers. The wolf inside her, silent for so long, let out a single, soundless howl of pure final agony. It was the sound of a spirit breaking. When the world swam back into focus, she was on the ground, the horse standing patiently beside her. The sun was low, painting the snow in shades of orange and pink. She was alone, in the ruins of a life, with nothing but a horse, a knife, and the ghost of a self she no longer recognized. She had chosen this. She had chosen freedom, and as she looked at the vast, unforgiving wilderness stretching out before her, she finally understood what that freedom had cost her. Everything. The world returned in shards of fractured light and agonizing cold. For a timeless moment, Elise didn't know who or where she was. She was a creature of pure sensation, the sharp bite of frost on her cheeks, the rough texture of snow-dusted rock beneath her, the profound cavernous emptiness in her chest where a universe used to be. The final, violent severing of the bond had been an amputation of the soul. It had not just taken Carrick away, it had taken a fundamental part of herself, leaving a void that echoed with the first cry of his newborn son. Slowly, memory seeped back, a poison re-entering her veins. The horse, the flight, the choice. She pushed herself up, her limbs shaking with a weakness that was more than just physical. The mare stood nearby, her breath pluming in the twilight air, her dark eyes watching Elise with a placid animal concern. The sun was gone, leaving the sky a deep, bruised purple streaked with crimson. She was losing time. To be caught in the open after dark, in the heart of winter, was a death sentence. A new instinct, one she hadn't felt in a decade of protected Luna life, took over: survival. It was a cold, pragmatic thing, devoid of hope or despair. It was simply a series of tasks. Find shelter, make fire, eat. She forced her protesting body to move, her feet leaden in the deepening snow. She found a small overhang of rock, a shallow cave barely deep enough to shield her from the worst of the wind. She gathered dry twigs and fallen branches with numb, clumsy fingers, her movements slow and robotic. Using the flint and steel from the saddle pack, she managed to coax a small, hesitant flame to life. It sputtered and smoked before finally catching, casting a pathetic circle of flickering orange light against the encroaching dark. She huddled close to the meager warmth, gnawing on a piece of dry bread from her pack. It tasted like sawdust in her mouth. Every muscle in her body ached with a deep cellular exhaustion. The silence of her inner wolf was a tangible presence now, a dead weight in her mind. Without it, she was simply a woman. A small, fragile human thing alone in a vast, predatory wilderness. The fear was a constant low hum beneath the surface of her thoughts. Every snap of a distant twig, every hoot of an owl, sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through her. She must have dozed, lulled into a state of semi-consciousness by the fire's warmth and her own exhaustion. She was jerked awake by a scent on the wind. It cut through the clean, cold air and the smell of wood smoke, instantly raising the hairs on her arms. It was the scent of man. Unwashed, the scent of stale sweat, cheap ale, and iron. It was close, too close. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She scrambled to her feet, extinguishing the small fire with a frantic cascade of snow, plunging her small camp into darkness. She pressed herself back into the deepest shadows of the rock overhang, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Morwen's knife was in her hand, its worn handle a small, inadequate comfort. She heard their voices before she saw them, rough and guttural, carried on the night air. Saw the smoke from the ridge. Can't be far. Told you we'd catch it. Old man Hemlock paid good coin for a gray pelt. Said he saw it cross the river at dawn. Big one, he said. A female. They weren't looking for a person. They were hunters, and she was the prey. They had seen her horse, mistaken her for a lone wolf to be skinned and sold. The bitter irony of it was a fresh wound. She had been cast out by her own kind, only to be hunted as a beast by another. Two figures emerged from the trees, bulky shapes in the moonlight, carrying long, cruel-looking pikes tipped with iron. They moved with the confident swagger of men who believed themselves the apex predators in these woods. Fire was here, one of them grunted, kicking at the spot where her fire had been. Tracks are fresh, it's close, scared it off. It won't get far, the other one chuckled, a nasty, grating sound. Nowhere to run in this pass. We'll corner it against the rock slide. Be a nice, clean kill. They moved past her shelter, their gazes sweeping the trees ahead, completely unaware of the quarry cowering just feet away in the darkness. Ellis held her breath, every muscle screaming for her to run, to flee, but she was frozen, pinned by a terror so absolute it felt like being encased in ice. They were going to kill her, skin her, and no one in the world would ever know what had become of Elise Varick, the forgotten Luna. The sheer, brutal finality of it, the utter meaninglessness of her end, was a horror beyond anything she had ever imagined. And in that moment of absolute terror, something deep inside her shifted. The dead weight in her mind, the silent, broken wolf, stirred. It was not a grand awakening. It was a flicker. A single, primal spark of outrage ignited in the desolate landscape of her soul. No, the word was not a thought, but a feeling. A visceral, cellular rejection of this pathetic end. She had not survived the ruin of her life, had not chosen exile and oblivion, only to be butchered for a pelt by these two brutes. The hunters had stopped, sensing something. They turned, their eyes trying to pierce the shadows. One of them raised his pike, its iron tip glinting in the moonlight. The spark inside her roared into a conflagration. The silent wolf howled, not with grief, but with a fury that was tectonic in its force. It was the fury of the betrayed, the abandoned, the hunted, and it demanded to be unleashed. The pain of the shift was an agony unlike any she had ever known. It was not the fluid, powerful transformation of a practiced shifter. It was the rusty, grinding action of a long-dormant machine being forced back to life. Her bones broke and reformed with sickening cracks. Her muscles tore and rewove themselves into a new and deadly shape. A scream of pure, transformative agony was torn from her human throat, morphing into the guttural snarl of a beast. The hunters stared, their confident smirks melting into slack-jawed horror, as the woman they had unknowingly hunted dissolved into a nightmare of changing flesh and bone. When the shift was complete, Elise was gone. In her place stood a great gray wolf, larger than they could have imagined, its fur the color of storm clouds, its body lean and corded with the muscle of a survivor, but it was the eyes that held them paralyzed. They were not the yellow eyes of a simple beast. They were her eyes, intelligent, aware, and burning with a cold blue fire of absolute, undiluted rage. This was not the Luna's wolf, the companion creature that had walked placidly beside its alpha. This was something else, something older, something that had been sleeping and had been woken. This was the wolf in the ruins. The first hunter, recovering from his shock, let out a terrified yell and lunged with his pike. The wolf did not meet the charge head-on. It moved with a blur of speed, impossibly fast, ducking under the clumsy thrust. Its jaws, filled with teeth like shards of obsidian, clamped down on the man's leg, just above the knee. Bone crunched with a sound that was sickeningly loud in the night stillness. The man shrieked, a high, thin sound of agony, and went down. The second hunter, his face pale with terror, swung his own pike like a club. The wolf released the first man and sprang back, the iron head of the weapon whistling through the air where its head had been a second before. It circled him, low to the ground, its snarl a constant, terrifying rumble. It was not just fighting, it was thinking. It was using the terrain, her human mind still present within the beast's fury, guiding its every move. She saw the knife, her knife, Morwen's gift, lying in the snow where she had dropped it. With a feint to the left, she drew the hunter's attention, then burst forward with incredible speed. But she didn't attack him. She snatched the knife from the snow in her powerful jaws. The hunter stared, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. A wolf wielding a weapon. He backed away, stumbling, his terror absolute. Monster! Demon! The wolf spat the knife out, then nudged it with its nose, pushing it toward her human hand, which was now slowly, painfully reforming from the wolf's paw. The shift was reversing, but only just enough. She rose to her knees, a horrifying, half-shifted creature of myth and nightmare, wolf and woman fused together. She gripped the knife in her human hand, her other arm still a furred, clawed limb. She looked at the terrified man, her burning blue eyes promising a death he could not comprehend. He turned and ran, scrambling blindly through the trees, his screams echoing through the silent forest. She let him go. She turned back to the first man, who was trying to crawl away, dragging his mangled leg behind him, leaving a dark, wet trail in the snow. She stalked toward him, the knife held loosely in her hand. He looked up at her, his face a mask of pain and terror. She stood over him, the creature of two worlds, the ghost of Valmon, the beast of the wilderness. She was no longer just a broken woman. She was something more. Something forged in betrayal and tempered in the fire of her own survival. Her gaze lifted from the whimpering form at her feet and looked eastward, back in the direction of the home that had cast her out. The weight of Carrick's crown had secured his son, his line. But in doing so, it had unleashed something he could never have predicted. Morwen's word echoed in her mind. Unavenged. A king's debt had been called, and the wolf who had been sent to die had just learned how to collect. 5 winters had passed. 5 cycles of snow and thaw had scoured the mountains, washing away old tracks and carving new paths through the stone. The Valmon pack had a prince now, a strong, healthy boy with Carrick's dark hair and Brindis's steady gray eyes. The succession was secure. The borders were quiet. From the outside, the pack was a portrait of stability, ruled by an alpha king whose hard choices had, it seemed, borne fruit. But a rot had taken hold, deep in the heartwood of the pack. Carrick Valmond, the alpha king, was a haunted man. He ruled with a just hand and a cold heart, the warmth of his victory having long since faded into a chilling, permanent twilight. He had his heir, his strong new Luna, his secure kingdom. But he had no peace. In the dead of night, when the lodge was silent and the fires burned low, he would stand at the window of his study, staring out at the unforgiving eastern mountains, and listen for a ghost. He had expected her to die. He had convinced himself that the choice he gave her was a mercy, a quick end in the wilderness instead of a slow, agonizing one in his shadow. Her death would have been a tragedy, a sorrow he could have carried with a king's noble grief. But she had not died. The first rumors had been dismissed as the ravings of a terrified hunter, a man found half mad with fear and a mangled leg, babbling about a gray demon, a wolf that was a woman, a monster that wielded a blade. But then came other stories. Whispers from trappers and merchants traveling the high passes. Tales of a lone gray wolf, impossibly large, unnaturally cunning, that stalked the edges of Valmon territory. They said it did not hunt for food, but for justice. Men who were cruel to their mates, alphas who ruled with fear, pack members who preyed on the weak. They would find their traps sprung, their patrols harassed, their authority challenged by a phantom that left only a single, chilling set of tracks in the snow. They called her the Ghost of the East Ridge, a legend, a campfire story to frighten pups. But Carrick knew. In the marrow of his bones he knew it was Alyss. The bond was gone, but its absence was a presence. It was a phantom limb that ached with every change in the weather, a hollow space in his soul that echoed with her name. He would look at his son, his pride and joy, and feel a pang of something cold and sharp. This child, the symbol of his legacy, was also the monument to his greatest betrayal. He would feel Brindis's hand in his, her quiet strength a constant support, and yet find himself remembering the fierce, intelligent fire in another woman's eyes. He had chosen legacy over love, and he was now king of a cold and empty dynasty. One evening, as the first snow of the 6th winter began to fall, Tegan, now the captain of his guard, brought him a message. It was from a patrol on the far eastern border. They had found something, not a body, not a sign of a struggle, just an object, placed deliberately on the ancient stone that marked the edge of their lands. Carrick rode out himself against the council of his betas. He rode alone, the falling snow muffling the sound of his horse's hooves, the world shrinking to a swirl of white and gray. He found the marker stone, a great gray monolith that had stood for centuries, and there, resting in a small hollow at its center, was a small, crudely carved wooden wolf. He dismounted, his legs unsteady. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked it up. He remembered the day her father had given it to her. He remembered her laughing, a sound he had not truly heard in years. It was the last piece of her old life, the one she had carried with her into exile. It was a message. She was letting go, not of her anger, not of her new life, but of him. She was returning the last piece of the girl he had known, the girl he had broken. It was an act of final severance. She was no longer Elise Varick, the ghost of his past. She was someone, something else entirely now. The message was clear. You are no longer my concern. My haunting of you is over. He clutched the small wooden toy, the cold of it seeping into his skin, and for the first time since that terrible night, the Alpha King wept. He wept for the woman he had lost, for the man he might have been, for the hollow crown he now wore. His tears froze on his cheeks, and he knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the stone beneath his feet, that this was his true punishment. Not to be hated, but to be forgotten, to be rendered irrelevant to the story of the woman he had wronged. Far away, high in the snow-swept peaks that bordered the sky, a great gray wolf stood on a precipice, watching the lone figure of a king shrink in the distance. Her blue eyes, no longer burning with rage, held the calm, clear light of a winter sky. The wind whipped through her thick fur, carrying with it the scent of pine, of stone, and of a freedom so vast it had no name. She was not alone. From the shadows of the rocks behind her, other wolves emerged. Not a pack in the old sense, born of blood and law, but a pack forged in survival. A one-eyed elder cast out from his pack for his age, a young she-wolf who had fled a brutal mate, a pair of orphaned pups she had found starving near a frozen river. They were the broken, the discarded, the forgotten, and she was their alpha. Not by dominance, but by example, she had taught them to hunt with cunning, to fight with intelligence, to survive not just the wilderness, but the memory of what they had lost. She had found a new purpose, not in ruling, but in rescuing. She was the guardian of the lost, a quiet legend whispered on the wind. She was no longer defined by the man who had cast her out, nor the title she had lost. Her past was an echo, its pain dulled to a scar that was a part of her, but no longer the whole of her. She turned her back on the valley of her old life, the wooden wolf a released burden, and nudged one of the young pups with her nose. The wind howled around them, a wild and lonely song, but to her, it was the sound of peace. It was the sound of a story that had not ended in the ruins, but had found a new, stronger beginning, written not in the ledgers of kings, but in the untamed snows of the wild. Her name was an echo, her legend a whisper, and her future, at last, was her own.